Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Osint Bunker podcast. This is season 4, episode 12, our season 4 finale, and also our, I suppose we call it the Christmas special. We're going to be discussing the US's Christmas present to Ukraine tonight, among other things, and we're joined this evening by a host of guests from the Osint community, including analyst Mick, Austin, who, as many of you will be aware, will be joining us from next season as an official host of the podcast. We're joined again by Cassis Belli, who's featured a number of times, and also by Granger, who I don't think has been a guest as of yet, but welcome aboard, guys.
Yeah, and I think, Granger, if you just want to really quickly introduce yourself, as I think you're the only person who hasn't been introduced on the podcast yet.
Yeah, I've been new here, or good evening, or basically good morning from the Philippines. So I'm Granger. I'm the naval nerd when it comes to Twitter. One of the naval nerds basically. So I was part of the basically the ones that have been watching Russia's naval movements before and during the war, but until now I'm lying down because busy with real time job. So yeah, I'm still monitoring for now.
Yeah, no, you're the resident terrifier of PLAN planners.
Yeah, because I'm literally just watching them menacingly from across the sea.
the I'll be watching you. Yeah. So, oh man, we have a lot to talk about this week. I think we should probably just launch into the latest U.S. aid package, which has just been released in actual numbers, and turns out was not just Patriots, but also more HIMARS ammunition, as always. Some other interesting stuff as well. A lot of mortar rounds, about I think 10,000 120 millimeter mortar rounds, and as we've seen over the past few weeks, the types of mortar rounds may be varied as well. I think we also have more HARMs, quote precision aerial munitions, which appear to be at this point JDAM kits. Additional tactical secure communication systems, which have been important. And then I think the key thing of this package, actually, that's probably going to get passed on in most coverage, is the USAI DoD sort of conglomerating remaining Warsaw Pact era ammunition and giving it to Ukraine, including 45,000 122 millimeter artillery rounds, 20,000 122 millimeter artillery rounds, 50,000 grad rockets, and 100,000 rounds of 125 millimeter tank ammunition, which I think we've been sort of ballparking what that looks like versus the current Ukrainian burn rate of ammunition, and that is, I mean, at this point, a couple of months of ammunition for various parts of the front, which I think is now making up for some of, or the lack of ammunition captured in the past couple of months.
Yeah, I would say I look at this package in two different sectors. The first being sort of sustainment, and the second being, I haven't really come up with a word for it. It feels like mission creep, but I guess it's more technology creep. Where on the sustainment front, we're seeing, like Technical said, sort of that conglomeration of Warsaw Pact munitions that, most analysts have been saying, needs to continue to happen. And we've seen sort of the Western Alliance do so in a somewhat piecemeal manner. But that's going to be very critical moving into the winter months if the Ukrainians decide to continue their offensive actions and they continue the sort of munition burn rate we've seen so far. On the second sector, with this sort of technology creep, we're seeing, the United States, for one, starting to put forth technology that previously it was very apprehensive about, whether that's precision-guided munitions, whether that's Patriot systems. The question for me sort of moving forward is, now that we've sort of breached the Patriot barrier, what does that look like for other systems that previously have been off the table, such as aircraft or, further munitions that will be bolted on to MiG-29s? And, what does this look like 2-3 months from now?
Yeah, I think there definitely is sort of an established pattern this moment of bolting on NATO equipment to Ukrainian Air Force assets, which, I mean, if we're not going to give them F-16s at this point, then giving their existing platforms the capability to conduct those strikes I think is the next best thing. Giving MiG-29s the capability to conduct SEAD missions, and it looks like the Ukrainians have been pretty effective in menacing existing Russian air defense assets near the front with their newly acquired HARMs launched from MiG-29s. I think that it's definitely a huge sort of asset for them to have, especially as they move into acquiring sort of precision guided munitions. It's definitely potential. There is a potential that we could see more munitions being sort of thrown on, especially as the U.S. continues to test and figures out, what they can add to sort of supplement existing Ukrainian capabilities. And I think we'll continue to see that grow. I'm sorry, how many of you are in here and I'm not getting a comment on that? Boo.
I mean, I think we're already in alignment there. I mean, exactly what you said. We're going to continue bolting on, weapons platforms to, existing Ukrainian aircraft until, should, I guess, we get to the point where we start seeing Western aircraft flying in Ukraine under the Ukrainian roundel.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so at what point do you think we're going to manage to bolt an AMRAAM onto a MiG-29?
I had that in the back of my head, and I'm like, at what point do we all sort of like googly eye when we see an AMRAAM knock down a Tu-95? But I don't know. I guess that's a when question, not an if. I mean, we've already seen the harms. We're seeing the JDAM kits going over now. I don't really see, AMRAAMs as being this sort of like, number one, like a technology that's brand new, and number two, being something that the U.S. in particular would be like, oh, that's a bridge too far right there. We can't let their planes shoot down Russian planes. Like, how could we do that?
I mean,
Yeah,
one
I
part
mean-
of the sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I mean, one part of the deliveries of munitions is, I think, the different angles of attack, as we have seen with the HIMARS systems. They have been quite effective for some time, but then it seems that the Russians adapted to it. As we know, they're quite incompetent in some areas, but they still adapt to some point. And now with the harms, I think they may also be slowly adapting to that. So if the Ukrainians want to continue to exploit further angles, I think the Americans and also other NATO allies have to look into other capabilities to supply.
Yeah,
to
I also
attack
think
angles.
the side
Yeah.
effect of HIMARS was kind of the adapt or die mentality of basically if there was a high value Russian target within say 40 miles of the front line, it was a target. And could be hit. And the Ukrainians kind of methodically went through those larger Russian assets in that range. And the Russians kind of just moved back their assets from being that close to the front, which has caused them logistic issues almost certainly. Um, not being able to stockpile artillery ammunition or other assets closer to where they're actually firing from is probably straining their capabilities, especially as we've seen since day one of the war. Their transport capabilities are lacking at best. And so I think that's a huge advantage that the Ukrainians have. And then of course they've started to utilize HIMARS to attack other targets, especially during important strategic strongholds and other attacks. So I definitely the Russians have adapted to HIMARS being present on the battlefield. And I'm sure new assets as they continue to arrive will sort of evolve the battle space in a way that Russia isn't expecting. And as we see those sort of enter the battle space, the Russians will have to deal with it. The speed of which is definitely in question.
Speaking of
Okay, go on.
okay, so speaking of bolting Western stuff on MiGs and Sukhoi aircraft of the Ukrainian Air Force, We in my like opinion and my thinking, I think someone behind the US has been helping Ukraine bolt them to their aircraft because you got to remember that there is system incompatibility between Western munitions and Eastern systems within those aircraft. And the only, uh, what let's say, competent country that has enough experience with mix and matching Western equipment with Eastern equipment is, well, Israel. So in my what I call this far distant idea, the only support that maybe the country or Israel has provided, since in theory they couldn't provide overt support because with the connections with Russia in the Syrian uh, field. So basically, their support is, in my idea, is basically on the support of mounting Western munitions on Eastern aircraft because they have experience. Like the Israeli military-industrial complex is basically one of the only MICs that are proficient enough to merge both East and West technologies and work them seamlessly. So yeah, that's an idea of the top of my head that is a possibility that they might have some assistance.
I
Yeah,
mean,
that's actually that's super interesting because I know Israel is currently dealing right now with sort of the proposition that Iran is acquiring combat experience in Russia or through Russia. They have advisors or it's fairly well known that they have advisors on the ground assisting Russia, at least in Russia, with their loitering munitions and potentially at some point ballistic missiles. And so I think there may be the Israeli interest in sort of blunting that as much as possible, especially now that Iran may be able to test their ballistic missiles against assets like Patriot in Ukraine. And they're loitering munitions against Patriot, which the Israelis may be somewhat concerned about and may sort of drive them to increase their not overt assistance, but definitely sort of areas of assistance.
One thing I would like to add to Jander's point, Israel isn't the only country who adapted NATO munitions to Eastern Bloc aircraft, like, for example, Germany. We received a lot of the material from the East German Army, which I think also included MiG-21s and MiG-29s, sorry. And I think we bolted on a couple of NATO munitions, but we later sold them onto Poland, which I think also do that. So both Poland and Germany should have some knowledge and capability.
yeah.
But at least with the respect to Germany, we have a general problem with bleeding knowledge from our armed forces. So it's probably unfortunately gone here. But I think the Poles still retain that capability and they're quite close and do want to have Ukraine. So I think that
Yeah.
definitely Poles running around.
Well, so I know there are a bunch of various upgrade programs. I know even Romania has experimented or did finally with their implementation of the Lancer MiG-21, um, added in helmet mounted queuing systems, Israeli radar systems, the Python 3. I know Poland and Germany have worked together on various upgrade systems to the MiG-29. I think what's the one in the German service, the MiG-29 GT, which received I would have to this would require more research because a lot of different parties have done significant upgrades to their systems. I know the MiG-29G, which was it was an East German MiG-29U and UB, which was upgraded to NATO standards uh, uh, in I believe the 90s. So there's a lot of them that sort of got these various different upgrades with systems from various different partners, and a lot of places have sort of experimented, especially post collapse of the Soviet Union, with those upgrades to MiG-29s. Just all the ones that I can think of right now are MiG-29 GT, MiG-29 AS, MiG-29 Sniper. Yeah, there's a lot of these different options, and I'm sure that sort of they're building on those bases from different partners.
Also, besides all of that, I wanted to ask you, what do you think? Like, why the US just sent this huge package to the Ukraine? Like, are they expecting something coming soon from the Russian side? Like maybe in a few months or something? Or what do you think about it?
I would say this is possibly a response to individual needs that sort of collated into like one big blob of requirements that could be filled by this package. I know there was the rumors of Iranian ballistic missiles that sort of would prompt the need for an anti-ballistic missile system, particularly in the Kiev area. I think that there's also there was the need for ammunition in that the Ukrainians haven't been able to receive some donations from Russia in a bit. So that I believe was particularly important to get those USAI ammunition donations. I think that right now it's sort of a critical point in the war where you have the Russians pushing on Bakhmut and the Ukrainians have been fairly consistently able, especially over the past week during the most heavy fighting where the Russians made a serious attempt at pushing into the city. The Ukrainians were able to repulse them, and I think that's been essential to sort of keeping their front in the east there together. And I think this package responds to a lot of needs they have currently on the ground. It's a lot of varying needs from varying threats, but sort of that's where it's gone. Does anyone else have any ideas on sort of why this packet or a package of this size might be coming right now?
I think it's fair to say the packages we've seen in the last couple of months have been sort of growing and escalating in size anyway. So a package of this size probably wasn't too unexpected. But as you say, it's more the contents of the package this time round that are of note. As we say, the JDAM kits and the Patriot missiles, obviously not having been kit before, we could obviously sort of try and extrapolate and guess at what a package of the next size up, so to speak, in the new year could look like. And as you say, how long before other items of kit like the Patriot that were previously off the table are on the table and end up getting delivered. We've obviously seen a number of European countries have been only too happy to supply certain items of kit, vehicles for example, that the Americans have been very, very cagey around the idea of delivering. I don't know if you guys have any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say that this package is sort of indicative that, and I think we're going to see packages moving forward. I think we're always going to see the sustainment aspect, right? We're always going to see ammunition, depending upon burn rate, depending upon, which battles are being waged. But in regards to the introduction of new technology, I think we've reached a point where the Western Alliance is receiving consistent data on how systems are being used, as well as receiving data on sort of what areas in the battle space could use improvement. I think, as was kind of talked about earlier, the idea of sort of a ballistic missile threat in a conventional sense over Kyiv is a really good sort of example of, all right, we have the Patriot batteries, we can supply them, that can sort of patch that hole in the wall. And in regards to sort of the JDAM kits, I think what we've seen so far is artillery platforms, precision artillery platforms such as HIMARS have been very effective at sort of disrupting Russian formations. So I think sort of the indicator there is that there's either a lack of aerial-borne precision-guided munitions in the Ukrainians' arsenal, or sort of planners at the DoD see sort of an opportunity to expand upon their usage in what we've seen so far in areas such as Bakhmut. So I think moving forward, we're going to see more of these sort of targeted supply. I'm going to call it a tranche, just as sort of Western planners are receiving more data on what's going on in the battle space and what technologies could potentially sort of shift it further in Ukraine's favor.
Yeah, and as these technologies continue, I think we're seeing sort of that merge of old and new, especially, you know, with that USAI aid, the which is in effect a lot of ammunition for systems that Ukraine had day one, or that systems that Ukraine has captured from Russia in a, you know, fairly significant number at this point, looking back at Oryx's list. But also there is that new fusion of either getting systems that can work with what Ukraine has at the moment, building Ukrainian capabilities, especially I'm looking at the Humvees, the MRAPs, systems like that that have sort of worked really well in making these highly mechanized Ukrainian formations that have been able to take advantage of breakthroughs and really sort of move against the Russians. I definitely see that aid and you know the communications and stuff, the training, maintenance, and sustainment as sort of that fusion of newer technologies with what Ukraine already had on the field. And then of course there's what Ukraine is doing domestically without, you know, foreign aid sort of taken into account. The actions they've taken to integrate drones into what they do. I mean, we just saw, you know, a recent video I posted of a DJI what is it? Matrice R300 RTK, which is a highly capable airborne UAV platform, um, which is in service with a territorial defense brigade. So I think we're seeing sort of that sensor fusion, and we've also seen a lot of videos of Ukrainian forces, you know, live streaming back information to headquarters over Google Meet, which is still just an insane thing that they've been able to sort of put together these secure communications methods that are somewhat janky but work.
And ultimately, it's a good learning curve for the US and for NATO as well, because to a certain extent, when we think of the US and NATO and military operations, it's always very, very high end kit, very high end technology. And particularly where obviously we've spent most of the last 20 years dealing with very, very low end sort of technology enemies in the likes of Afghanistan and Iraq fighting terrorism. It's interesting for the Americans, I think, and for NATO as a whole to look at the way Ukraine sort of not being a low end fighter, but at the same time not being sort of on a par with the US and the rest of NATO, is able to take these technologies and use them in a way that perhaps we've not seen before.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
know again how to fight on a peer-to-peer conflict. We've seen that like early when the war started with all the announcements from Europe. Oh, for the land war, we have to prepare our armies for that. And at least here in Germany, there was a lot of talk, but nothing really came of it. So we also have to think, are these lessons incorporated later into our military structure? Will the lessons be learned? No, I'm not that hopeful.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, there are huge lessons to be learned, of course, on integration of drone assets, sort of how fires or how traditional capabilities have changed when integrated with sort of a new layer of ISR capabilities when it comes to drones. That's a huge thing that I think is going to be a takeaway of this conflict. Um, but I think there are also lessons like conventional mechanized warfare is a bit more complex, and requires a heck of a lot of investment to actually make it work. What the U.S. did in Iraq was, frankly, unparalleled. In a demonstration of capabilities, and that Russia couldn't even, you know, slightly replicate it in their own backyard. Um, I think that's definitely an element of this as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And what we've seen is sort of a reassertion of American and other sort of Western defense planners sort of thoughts on logistics. Like in order to recreate an Iraq, either, the first or the second one, you need to have a consistent, sort of unfettered supply line going towards your units on the ground or towards your aerial assets. And to this day, we haven't seen, the VKS being able to establish air dominance, let alone air superiority.
Massive shocker, clinically underfunding your Air Force assets and not giving, your pilots the requisite training and your equipment the required maintenance hurts your ability to conduct strike operations and other operations against enemy forces.
Well, we talk a lot about, how the Ukrainians have been able to sort of put together sort of solutions outside of the conventional mindset in regards to like jury rigging various arms or finding workarounds for secure communications and everything like that. I think one of the least desirable jobs right now in the world would be a Russian aircraft mechanic trying to figure out how to replace, extremely precise subsystems into a
Well,
plane that if it doesn't have that system working, it will go into the ground.
I mean, at this point, you probably have less and less planes to repair as time goes on. Especially those Su-34 mechanics. They're probably, I mean, what percentage of Su-34s has Russia lost so far of their available fleet? Let me just pull up Oryx's list real quick here. I mean, Russia has like 120 Su-34s.
It was
Mad.
from last month. It was 10% of the fleet.
Yeah, so they have lost 17. No, correction. Probably somewhere between 17 to 20 Su-34s.
Oh yeah, so 10% of their fleet, which is
Yeah.
around 100. So it's very limited.
Yeah, and well, when you think about it, what percentage, are combat capable at any one time? Like probably,
Probably not
maybe
even 30%, I'd say, given.
yeah, and so that's maybe you have 50, say, aircraft that are actually available at any one time, and you've lost 20 of the most available aircraft because those were the ones that were flying combat missions. And so then when you think about that and you think about sort of they're losing the most, capable aircraft in their inventory because those are the aircraft that they're sending over Ukraine. Um, it's definitely a huge impact on their capabilities to conduct air warfare in other places. And when you look at the units that are losing aircraft, these are units that have the most, experience in Syria, and which has been a training ground for Russian systems. I don't think as much the Air Force. We saw a lot of work on the Caliber in Syria, developing that and sort of improving it. But I really don't think that we've seen much work done on their strike capabilities. I mean, we saw Su-34s dropping dumb bombs over Syria, and lo and behold, over Ukraine, they try to do high altitude dumb bombing, and they get shot down. They try to do low altitude dumb bombing, and they get shot down by man pads. And so I think that's also another big thing is that the Russians were not prepared to fight an adversary with an actual existing air defense network.
Yeah.
And that
Definitely.
yeah.
And their
Plus,
helicopter fleet as well has suffered massively. I mean, I can't count the number of videos I've seen now of KA-52s and Heinz being shot down by, as you say, manpads, or even just by the Russians themselves. The amount of friendly fire against Russian aircraft has been quite alarming, really.
Well, in fairness, we also saw friendly fire against Ukrainian assets. Granted, the Ukrainians had less losses in sort of that department because they were just conducting less sorties or fewer sorties against Russian forces. But I do think that is sort of a continuing element of this of, air warfare when you don't have stuff like IFF, when you don't have these issues already worked out, which the US had and ran into back in, the first Gulf War, of sort of how to handle that, controlling of the air battle space. Russia just hasn't had the opportunity to face that because before Ukraine, pretty much all their enemies had no air superior, actually had no air assets to speak of, and very limited surface to air assets. And so I think now that Russia sort of rushed into this headlong, they're learning a lot of these lessons the really hard way. I think that also we can connect to China as well. China really hasn't had that chance to experiment against or actually have a conflict situation where they've tested these things out.
So to add to share to some things about the losses of equipment like the Su-34s, the Ka-52s, it's also indicative that Russia has been playing them on what they were intended to do. So to add context, the Su-34s were considered as frontline bombers. So basically, the equivalent of the F-111 aardvarks in the West, basically. So or the tornado in Europe. So basically, frontline ground pounders dropping bombs, cluster munitions, and the like. So they were basically intended to do a lot of damage at the front line. So basically, yeah, a frontline bomber. So their losses is basically just that due to bombing at the front lines, just that they were bombing at the front lines without any other air support, either from ground or from air. They literally are just going headlong, bombing like dumb bombs or doing rough SIAD, which to to put it in other context, Russian SIAD doctrine is well rough because in the Soviet days it's also a bit rough, and by historical chance, there were a lot of well, speaking of IFFs, friendly fire, back in the Soviet days, like in strategic exercises, like you see this in various propaganda movies. You've seen it before, like massive formations and the like. The Soviet air forces expected to have at least around 40 to 50% attrition rate from their friendly forces alone because the ground forces and the air force don't have enough what they call this experience working together. They're basically operating on isolated from each other. No ground communication, no coordinated attacks. It's really hard back then. So back in the Soviet days and until now, they are still suffering from miscommunication, the branch not talking to each other to avoid friendly fire, and we've seen many friendly fire. And also the misuse of equipment. So, for example, the Ka-52s were supposed to be designed primarily for recon, but due to the losses of many attack helicopters like the Mi-28s, some Mi-24s, some retrofitted Mi-8 HIPs, they were forced to be attack helicopters and they suffered greatly. So, yeah, it's a mix and match of problems that they have that they couldn't sustain from long, literally, what they call this, chronic issues dating back from the Soviet period, like miscommunications, from misuse of the equipment to basically, well, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but sheer incompetence. That's it.
Yeah, well, also there's incompetence and then there's chronic underfunding and limitations to training and capabilities that come from those issues. And when you have, a large portion of your military budget just being siphoned away through corruption, it certainly doesn't help. Um,
Yeah, when you look at the funding structure of the Russian armed forces, there's only you can only point to two branches that gets proper funding. Or wait, three. Wait, two. Or yeah, probably three at
Definitely
this
not the
point.
Navy.
Yeah, wait. The Navy submarine force gets a lot of funding.
Yeah.
There's a lot of meme like jokes that have been running around that due to sanctions, the Russian Navy might be downgraded to from a blue water navy to a brown water navy, so a literal combat force. But some people might say, some people in probably in the Russian social media and in various veteran forums, they said that the government would sacrifice the surface fleet long before they would cut budget to the submarine fleet because um in the grand scheme of things, the Russian Navy is basically a submarine fleet first, or rather than a surface fleet first compared to, let's say, the US, where they have the mainstay will be carriers, destroyers, cruisers. The Russian Navy is basically submarines, submarines, and submarines. Like, yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
there are,
going back to the Soviet Navy, if you looked at, what Soviet naval aviation was,
yeah,
the first Soviet carriers were mainly meant to be at the core of anti-submarine battle groups that
marine.
would work with submarines.
And they were never called
Yes,
aircraft carriers either. They were always aircraft carrying cruisers or similar sort of designations that to the vast majority of Western countries sounded rather odd.
yeah, because if you even look at it now, the air wings of those Kiev class quote unquote aircraft carriers are basically um Ka-25s, Ka-27s, anti-submarine helicopters. They basically outnumber the amount of VTOL aircraft they are equipped with, like 5 to 1 usually. So you have like 40 anti-submarine helicopters to just 10 VTOL aircraft because the VTOL aircraft were just for fleet area air defense, basically. So their primary mission was mainly for hunting submarines because they knew back then that, well, submarines are the undisputed king of the basically the naval warfare. They can hide, they could sink you without warning, and they could strike from land. So it's basically a good investment for them. But then again, it's one of the branches that hasn't been siphoned off with budget. The other one would be the strategic forces. That's it. The land ballistic missiles. The Air Force, they got siphoned off because when I'm going to share this, it might be long, but when Serdyukov was kicked out, Defense Minister Serdyukov, which was the Minister of Defense that spearheaded the buy from Europe spree from Russia, where they bought the Mistral LHDs from France, thermal equipment from Thales, what they call this, the Iveco armored
Yeah, the
personnel carriers
LMV.
from,
Yeah.
yeah, it was spearheaded by Sergeyov because he knew, plus Sergeyov was a businessman first, not a military man. So Sergeyov knew that the Russian military industrial complex is bloated with corruption, with inefficiencies, with lacks of connections where your budget goes off somewhere in the black hole. So there's you could see the influences when it comes to equipment, like the Air Force heavily relied on sales inertial navigation systems, multifunction displays, even helmet mounted queuing systems have some parts of it from European equipment. The other would be radars, like ship radars, for example, have been experiencing supply issues, quote unquote supply issues, due to the sanctions because apparently some of the modules have been sourced from European countries, and that was started during his term as Secretary of Defense or Minister of Defense. But when he was unseated and was replaced by Shoigu, and the corruption just basically resumed. We have less training for the Air Force, a stagnating modernization program of Cold War bombers and Cold War era aircrafts for the Air Force. You have projects that are supposed to be revolutionary, like the T-14, that have been experiencing slowdowns. And for the Navy, it's the reintroduction of ghost companies where they bid on naval projects and somehow they never deliver. So
Wait,
yeah,
so the 50 different new Russian carrier designs over the past 10 years have all been fake?
so I'm going to explain that too. So in the Russian military-industrial complex, the naval side, that is, there's one company that has been prevalent in making really, really weird shipyard designs, and that is Krylov State Research Center. So you might Krylov State Research Center is basically a hydrographic research center where their main purpose is to study or what they call this test hull designs. Keyword is hull designs, not above the water ship design. So if you see weird carrier or ship designs like the leader class nuclear cruisers, those really weird pagoda style carriers, there's are chances that it's from them, and the military and even the government ignores them because they are first and foremost a hull uh what you call this a hull experiment agency. So they only test experimental hulls, current hull designs, future ship hull designs. They're just basically hydrographics. They only test hulls. They're not supposed to design superstructures, ship systems, but they insisted on it, and it garnered a lot of media attention. Like, oh look, new Russian carrier designs. When it was all a fluke. It was all fake because even the what you call this the naval command just shies away when they see such weird renders. So yeah, they are fake, and they're also a butt of joke in the both in the internal Russian naval enthusiasts, uh, defense enthusiasts. It's a butt of jokes for them because it's unfeasible. Plus, the current structure, even now, even before the war, is not conducive to have any carrier battle groups. It's not supportive. It's not what do you call this? It's not suitable. In short, it's not suitable for a carrier. They're mostly for submarine support, some limited travel to the sea. So carriers is not a good fit for them. That's for sure.
Yeah, I think that one of the elements that has proven to be problematic with Russia is the inability to sort of project power in without, solid basing and cooperation from a host country. Um, even projecting power slightly outside of their borders into Ukraine has been a difficult operation. After the Ukrainian sinking of the Moskva in the Black Sea, I think we saw also a Russian pullback with their naval assets as well, and they're now mostly limited to conducting caliber cruise missile strikes, which they could be doing from the Caspian Sea anyway. Um, so I definitely think that the ingrained corruption has really hurt that Russian capability to actually conduct warfare. Like, period, end of story. Like, it's just it has been taken back to a point where they are not on par with Ukraine per se, but they aren't able to amass enough offensive power to overcome existing Ukrainian defenses. After, of course, the initial phase of the conflict.
Yeah, that's true. Due to the prior to the war itself, some people, literally, like a lot, ignored, even me also, was ignored the shortcomings that was mentioned by a lot of free press in Russia when it comes to deficiencies, when it comes to training, equipment supplies, military contracts, like even for communications, part supply. We somehow overlooked it because, sheer modernization, sheer lots of manpower being transported near the border. But prior to that, a lot of people, even me included, ignored the fact that the entire Russian army is literally walking on a suspension bridge that is full of holes at that point because the industrial corruption, the bloat that was being created. Like every year, there's a lot of new companies creating new supposedly products, but just a rehash of Soviet era designs. I'm looking at you, Panzer. I know you. So it's basically that plus inefficient training plus the officer core basically what do you call this, not knowing how to fight because they just rushed in. So yeah, that's going to be one of the highlights of this war when it will end, is that a lot of people overlook the problems due to the what I call this due to the many new technologies that they are showing off, the new capabilities, that we were blinded to the fact that some of the deficiencies have been overlooked. And a lot of respected analysts have also, or in my observation, overlooked that they have still have growing issues going into the war and until now.
I mean, I definitely think that is a huge problem that the Russians have faced. Just the ongoing issues. A lot of us may have ignored, or I think there was the assumption that, until or at least the idea that until it faced contact, we had no idea how the Russian military would fare. Um there is always the temptation, and I think all of us, or I think a lot of people fell into it, of just looking at the numbers on paper and just looking at what assets Russia had available, what capabilities they had, just the Russian Air Force alone, the Russian missile forces, the Russian Navy, what they had massed in the Black Sea at the same time. And I think there was this idea that, even if there was a certain amount of corruption, Russia still had all these assets in play. Um, and I don't think we really realized how deep the sort of dysfunction within the Russian military was, and how badly positioned they were to face any type of resistance.
Definitely agree with you two, and I remember like back in February, just before the war started, I remember discussing all the build-up and stuff with an acquaintance of mine who worked in the Russian defense market, and he said, like, man, you have to look the Russian army. He was, I think, he served formerly in there, because with the conscription stuff, and he told me, really, look, it's not going well for them. The army is not well equipped. They are not there. They can't fight a war. But yeah, was Granger before said, it really looked more impressive in media before, from what we've seen, also from what a lot of the analysts who focus on Russia said and wrote before that. So it was a quite interesting, like, first couple weeks to see what you expected to happen to what really happened, and that was a significant difference, at least for me.
Yeah, and again, I think there were a lot of competing opinions on what would happen. Um, I don't I don't think there were many people who said, or at least would have thought, that this, what actually happened in reality was a likely outcome. Um, I definitely think this has been surprising, to a certain degree.
And I honestly wonder if we will see the start of negotiations soon between Ukraine and Russia to end this war, of course, because I've read that a lot of people, even in the US, started slowly talking about eventual peace talks, and maybe it's yet too early, but I wonder if it will take so long yet, or I wonder how it will goes in the few months. So,
I,
but honestly, with all this aid sent now to Ukraine, I highly doubt that they will start negotiating now.
I mean, it looks like the Ukrainians will continue to have the capability to regain more territory, um, as time goes on, and I don't really see any motivation within the Ukrainian government to cede territory that they have the capability to retake.
Yeah, and also there's the like what will happen to Crimea? Like, will they try to took it back, or will they like leave it to Russia? Or this is, I think, this is one of the main point for the discussion, but
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't think they'll have the capability to retake Crimea at any point in the near future. I do think they obviously have the ability to retake territory in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast and also in the south of the country as well. On the east bank of the Dnipro. I think they definitely have that capability and the drive to do it as well. Especially as Russian forces continue to be attrited. And face again the prospect of sitting in Ukraine for an entire winter with no real mechanism for rotation. I mean, some Russians have been constantly fighting now for almost a year, without any realistic chance of rotation, whereas Ukrainian forces have at least had some level of time to rest and refit between various offensives and with the ability or capabilities to rotate out reserve units to replace regular units at the front and allow them to at least re-equip and train. Maybe Russia will have that with mobilization, but I don't think they're there yet.
Plus, with such a large mobilization and such a need, like an instant need for manpower, yeah, you're going to encounter quality issues, and the quality of training is already questionable. Like we have seen that, but a rushed even a proper mobilization would take place. The need of enough manpower in the front would basically throw the proper modernization into the bin, because they would just send the people near the front, get quick training, not the proper training, just quick, and just send out to the front. Like
Yeah,
that's
I think
basically the expectation.
there are definitely a lot of questions about the efficacy of the Russian mobilization and how they can actually generate new units when yes, surprise surprise, all the NCOs who were going to be part of those new units and all the junior officers who could have been part of those units are either already in existing units in Ukraine or have been casualties in Ukraine or have been killed in action, wounded in action. Um, and so I think that those new Russian units are going to be very headless and so may not have the capabilities to actually conduct offensive operations. They may be literally just told, sit in this trench and shoot at any Ukrainians who come at you, and they will most likely be just used as to fill bodies in various formations as well. And so I think that's going to further decrease the Russian capabilities to actually conduct operations.
Considering that the most of the Russians in the front, like especially in the Crimean area, they're like making lots of reinforced positions. Yeah, that's basically one of the possible ways those new mobilized forces are going to go. More on the defensive line, where they just gonna sit there, point a machine gun at an open field, and when they see something that is not them or not friendly, they could just shoot. That's basically, in my honest opinion, that's how I surmise the new mobilization. Sure, there might be skilled ones like at the back, like logistics, medical, like that. You could train that properly. But when it comes to fighting, yeah, you're going to have very, very limited ways in comes to training, especially when all of the experienced ones are either captured, dead, or in the front lines and are busy. So they basically are stuck in a hard place when it comes to properly training them.
From what I heard about the Russian mobilization is that it's basically split into like two parts. One was directly sent to the front, as we have seen like in Kharkiv and Luhansk, where people who were mobilized like a couple of days before were thrown at the front and were killed or captured by Ukraine. But that also another part is apparently being trained somewhere. But there's again the question who is training them, as we've seen a couple months earlier that a lot of the training divisions and training units have been sent to Ukraine. So there is apparently someone saying a couple hundred, not a couple thousand, maybe 50, 60, 100. I don't know. I don't have much insight into the numbers, but there's some staying back training. But also that how will the quality be? I don't think it will be good, but it may be better than the ones thrown just at the lines in August. But also, I don't think it will be enough for like offensive maneuvers.
And so I guess the question is, ultimately, as you say, Russia is effectively running out of steam and has been for some time now. And I suppose the key question will be, how long do they realistically have to come to the table to negotiate before they run out completely and Ukraine potentially can turn around and just steamroll them back across the border?
I don't think it's running out of steam so much as losing the ability or losing capabilities in certain areas, where they can still sit around and defend areas, and filling rear areas with bodies is certainly going to help prevent some Ukrainian breakthroughs. Um, I do think though that their capability to actually conduct offensive operations may be diminished, or may continue to be diminished. Right now they're probably at their lowest. They may be able to fill out units with extra soldiers, but it's not going to be a replacement for the ones that they've already lost.
Yeah, their combat effectiveness when it comes to offensive, like even minor they could do, like within local setting they could do some limited, I mean very limited offensive operations. But when it's an entire front or an entire region, when you try to conduct a proper offensive operation, they're basically on the teething edge of combat ineffective for any sort of major offensive operations. Major defensive operations they could do, because you could just refill it you could just fill it with fresh mobilized troops to basically defend a location. But offensive ones is going to be hard, and considering the outlook of the war right now, they're basically more on the defensive, which they might sustain for longer. But unless the Russian command starts to have any more ideas of grandiose offensives, yeah, that's not going to happen. No major offensives will be being conducted when your frontline manpower is very, very low.
Also, if you compare to the Ukrainian regeneration of manpower, mm, especially with the help from NATO countries, specifically from the UK, it seems to have been much, much better carried out than with Russia. Of course, it is less, but the quality, at least what it appears to me as an outside observer, it definitely appears to be better. So if you compare it just the regeneration of units from the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side, I think Ukraine is definitely better off there. So also in the future, as the conflict will probably draw on for quite some time, it does seem that Ukraine definitely has an edge with replacing and regenerating manpower.
I think it helps counter to some Russian conspiracies that there aren't NATO training officers in Ukraine, but they're actually taking the time to take Ukrainian forces out of Ukraine, train them in NATO countries, and then send them back. Which I do think is important for the Ukrainian force generation structure. And even during this war, the Ukrainians have also invested. Their NCO and officer schools are still running. They are still training new NCOs and officers to both replace existing losses and help with the generation of new units, which is extremely important to what they're doing. I don't think the Russians are doing the same thing right now.
I think they mobilized the at least officer schools, from what I heard, and just took all the ones in training and put them in charge enough units and just
Yeah,
sent them
well,
to Ukraine.
they're doing arguably more harm to their officer corps than what already is happening.
True.
It's that common Russian situation of doing nothing would have been better.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
like
sure. But I think it also shows sort of the Russian desperation for or need so far for officers or NCOs, right? Like you don't gut your own sort of officer academies unless you absolutely need to. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for even further failure, 1, 2, 3 years down the line. Um, and so I think the big things to look at in regards to the Russians' abilities to wage sort of offensives are going to be equipment drain and then knowledge drain or brain drain, so to speak. Um, yeah, we're already seeing less and less Russian NCOs. We're seeing, less and less Russian units that are properly equipped, even more so than we saw at the beginning of the war. And I think, one of the myths about the Russian armed forces before the war, again, like Technical brought up, was that a lot of folks were kind of just looking at numbers. They were looking at, I remember in previous conversations about Russia, everyone would always sort of point to sort of their massive tank reserves, right? And that, they could sustain their armored divisions or just form new armored divisions out of thin air just because of the sheer amount of tanks they had in storage. Not really talking about, where are these depots? How often are they being checked on? How much of this equipment has been sold to any sort of other conflict around the world by folks like, there's been a lot of talk about Victor Boot lately, but that was sort of his game was going into these sort of Soviet depots, taking, a couple of vehicles from each one and then selling them on the market. So I think the question moving forward is, are we going to continue to see a depreciation of the Russian industrial base? And looking at that, are we going to start seeing attrition coming from lack of proper kit getting worse and worse?
Yeah, and as I think the other problem was that Russian ready reserves were in kind of a terrible state, also due to corruption. Um, and so they've had to dive deeper. Somehow, apparently, the T-62s were the most ready, maybe because they were the hardest to actually loot from. Um, but yeah, it's
uh,
definitely interesting.
I think I recall that back in, I think it was Vostok, the where the Chinese the strategic exercise where the Chinese were also a part of. So yeah, Vostok. It's called the East Strategic Exercise Vostok. I recall that I think a few years ago, 2018, 2019, where they tried to they included a lot of T-72As, T-62s in the exercise to see how quickly they could reinstate those older equipment from hot storage. So, and in my parlance, hot storage is basically ready storage that they could just prepare, uh, train, and send it to the front lines. While their cold storage is, well, ironically cold. It's literally sitting in the tundra in Siberia somewhere. It's literally cold storage where I think they're trying to dig up a lot of cold storage vehicles right now because a lot of the T-62s that have been appearing in the front lines have telltale signs that they were coming from cold storage, and they just got sent to um, what they call this army formations that specialized in vehicle reconditioning to basically put as little of a job as possible to making them combat capable. So basically doing the least work to make them like work to go them into the front line. So yeah, their ready reserves are already bad, like due to corruption. Plus they already are spent. Now they're probably digging to their cold reserves. And when I mean cold, I mean they are constantly being battered with ice or with heavy winter conditions. So yeah, cold storage, literally cold storage.
Um, yeah, I and we'll see how it how they manage to regenerate stuff um from cold storage. I think that the various rumors about, people basically just looting equipment from tanks in cold storage might have been correct. Um I believe at this point that most of, again, those modernized vehicles just don't exist in cold storage or even hot storage. Um and so we're probably just going to see, a lot of these parts tanks eventually make their way to the front. But it's that degradation of capabilities. Um, if they're missing important equipment, night vision sights, or some of them that may have had thermal sights, though almost certainly don't anymore. Um, if they don't have access to that equipment, then they're going to be fairly combat ineffective, unless it's in certain circumstances.
Speaking of thermal equipment for vehicles, you might have seen some of the tanks that are equipped with tails like optics, right, on tanks. Like it was prevalent in probably June, July, or August, where we see videos of BMPs, BMDs, T-72 B3s, T-80 BVMs, where they have like French equipment on them. I think it was fairly common, but we might see like reconditioned, like as this is on the same topic of regenerating units. Now that they lost access to Western or European equipment, they might have to utilize their own homegrown solutions. Now, I'm
That's
going
not
to,
good.
yeah, I'm going to give a quick breather. They tried to make yeah, indigenous solutions to their thermal equipment. Like they assembled them, like they created them. But the major component of thermal cameras, like the thermal sensitive sensors, are being sourced somewhere else. Those countries are either South Korea or China. Now they have achieved same quote unquote resolution fidelity as ones that were installed in their newer tanks that were equipped with French optics, but they are just very, very limited and also are prone to reliability issues. They just prefer French for their optics that they won't settle for probably indigenous ones that hasn't reached the standards of the French ones. So yeah, we might see quote unquote reconditioned tanks, BMPs that have supposedly new optics that just basically have been put together by a parts bin from experimental equipment or just half baked ones. We might see them sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how willing China is to help out at this point, especially with Russia's nuclear saber rattling. I think they may have toned that down recently because of Chinese influences. Um,
Yeah,
just
when
because
you
that kind of scared the Chinese.
look at the military semiconductor side, like the chips, there have been an increase of shipment of Chinese made chips like semiconductors. But there are also news that the um what they call this defect rate has gone up since the war started. Like prior to the war it was like 6 or 7% defect rate per shipment. Now it's around 40%. So yeah, the Russians are basically buying a lot, like rapid uh buying a lot of chips that they want now for their equipment, like for missiles, for guidance systems and such. But because it's China, they might have been sneaking in a lot of defectives that they want to sell off, and apparently, and unfortunately, Russia is the end destination for those quote unquote defective products they want to sold off.
It's the instead of, the Russian model of scamming your own countrymen, it's the Chinese model of scamming someone else.
Yeah.
Which objectively, hey, works a lot better in this environment.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the modern Russian equipment are basically just rebrands. If we have to simplify it, it's just rebrands or just assembled in Russia, but the components are sourced somewhere else.
Yes.
Like their screens on the soldiers, like their combat management software in their soldiers, like their strelets, where some have been sourced from Laika. I have seen a few that were branded as Russian, but when you rip the sticker from behind, it was branded as Laika. Wow, a German company. Like, who would have thought? Like, it's an eye opener for everyone that not of not a lot of Russia's new tech is new. Sometimes they're just a few generations behind and mainly sourced from somewhere else.
Yeah, it was like the Russian robot combat dog that was really just a Chinese one bought from AliExpress with what was in effect a sock thrown over it.
A kit bash, basically.
Yeah. All right, I'll John has been harassing me about ending this at some
I've
point
not been
reasonable.
harassing you.
It's a message. I can consider it harassment while I'm talking, John. So I think I'll let you handle the wrap up.
Yeah. Gents, it's been a pleasure having you all on. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm hoping some of you will be up for joining us again next season in 2023. And ladies and gentlemen, that is a wrap for the Osint Bunker podcast for 2022. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your continued support. We are fast approaching 3.5 million downloads worldwide. And we look forward to bringing you season 5 in the new year. So guys, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and Technical, cue the outro music.